Okay, welcome everybody to our, it was actually our 73rd. So I made a Roman numerals error in the titling of this talk. Those that are eagle-eyed, 73rd Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. This is one that's made in Oxfordshire. 3 authors on the paper, all in fairly close proximity, despite being at different institutions, none of which are in Oxfordshire. But it's a little part of this part of the UK, I guess, broadcasting out with Kerry, Papps from the University of Bath, and it's research that's been done with myself and also Alex Bryson at UCL. Before moving to the talk, before this session, talking with people about in-person conferences again, and there are a couple of in-person conferences planned for the coming months. Both of them are in Gijón in Spain, and so many of us will be familiar with the conferences over the years that have been in Gijón, organised by Placido Rodriguez. And so he is planning 2 conferences, and so I'm going to quickly share my screen and navigate to the first call for papers, which is the 5th Gijón Conference on the Economics of Leisure, Culture and Sport, due to be on November the 26th, 27th. And this is a conference that's aimed, as the details say down here, at graduate students or those that are within 5 years of their PhD. If you want to submit, then please do so at these email addresses, and I've put these documents on the team, or you can get in touch with me if you want more of the details. You've got until the deadline for the abstracts for this conference, and then I'm just going to skip to the other window, which is the 15th Gijón Conference on Sports Economics, Roger Knoll and Peter Sloan Golden Anniversary, which is scheduled to be December the 17th and 18th, and a very similar kind of format. Deadline for papers a little bit further ahead, November the 20th, but if you send them to Placido at one of his email addresses, and you will hear back at some point. So the conference will be in person ideally, but if not, it will be on Teams virtually. But let's hope for some in-person conferences in the coming months. In the meantime, we're still online, and it's great because we can meet online. We can have people all around the world joining us, which is fantastic. So without any further delay, I am now going to hand over to Kerry, who is going to give his presentation with the title, Running Up That Hill, Fitness in the Face of Recession.
Great. Well, thanks very much, James. We have all 3 co-authors, I think, here today. So I'll present, and James and Alex can answer all the tough questions. And I should say this is very much still work in progress. It's hot off the press, some of these results. So I'd definitely appreciate any comments that people have. So what we're sort of the starting point for this paper was sort of an observation from a series of papers that found that mortality rates in the US seem to follow let's get this right in the right way. Mortality rates tended to go up during good times and go down during recessions. So I guess that means they were pro-cyclical. And there's a sort of series of papers published in top journals, QJE, AER, that sort of found sort of consistent evidence that across US states, mortality rates were higher during good times and fell during recessions. Whereas at the same time, studies looking at sort of person level using longitudinal data sets tend to find the opposite. They tend to find that people who lose their jobs do worse in terms of health outcomes. So there seems to be a tension between these different studies about what's actually going on with people's health levels over the business cycle, if there's a causal relationship at all. So what we're trying to do here is I don't know if we're going to be able to reconcile any of these conflicts between these studies, but we're hoping to add some more evidence by drawing on fitness data or specifically running time information from Parkrun. So Parkrun, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, is a free weekly 5K running event that's held. Well, it's actually held around the world now. It started off in the UK, and we're going to be using UK data only. It's been going for 17 years now, and we're using all the observations that we can get up to the pandemic, when it shut down, or when it was suspended for for about 16 months. So we have about 20 million observations on people's 5K times observed, in many cases over sort of years. And what we're hoping to do here is to use this sort of longitudinal data on people's running times to see whether to see how their times change over the business cycle, controlling for person effects, location effects, week effects, and various other things. And what we'd expect here is that since heart disease is a leading cause, or is the leading cause of death among older people in the UK, and I think heart and circulatory diseases account for about a quarter of UK deaths, we would expect that if the business cycle really is driving mortality, then we would expect a sort of an intermediate effect to be a change in fitness levels, and therefore we'd expect a more immediate effect of the business cycle on fitness levels. So we're hoping that that by looking at fitness data, we can get a more sort of immediate and accurate effect of any business cycle effects that are going on. And then sort of simultaneously, there's a sort of a more sports-oriented, more professional reason to focus on this. I think I'm probably not the only one that's experienced journal editors who have rejected sports papers that I've sent because the sort of general idea that professional sports people are, not normal people, and their experiences are not really relevant to what goes on in the rest of the labour market. It's the sort of unspoken reason that's often given for why sports economic papers are not suitable for general economics journals. But there's a huge amount of data now on amateur sports people like Parkrun, and this seems to be underexploited. And I tried to make this case. This is a shameless plug, but I tried to make this case in a recent IZA World of Labour piece I wrote on sports at the vanguard of labour market policy. So trying to practice what I preach and actually sort of look at some of this data on really really normal people. In fact, James and I'm not sure about Alex, but James and I are actually in this data set, having run Parkrun frequently. So I think this is the first time I've ever done a project where I'm actually in the data set. So if I'm in there, if we're in there, then it must be fairly normal people that are in this data set. So just to preview the main results, what we find is that there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in the effects of economic conditions on fitness levels across age categories. Specifically, we find that running times follow a counter-cyclical pattern for men and women age 50 and above. So for men and women age 50 and above, their times actually improve during recessions. But a pro-cyclical relationship for men aged 20 to 49 and women 20 to 29. So for younger men and women, and for, I guess, sort of middle-aged men, there's evidence that their times get worse. They do worse during recessions. So there's sort of this very different pattern across the life cycle that might provide some insight into what's actually going on at the sort of macro level. We also find that participation rates are very sensitive to the business cycle. This is the bit that's hot off the press and needs further work. But men, particular men in their 30s, seem to increase their participation during recessions, whereas women in the sort of same age range reduce their participation. And then another thing that we've only done a very brief analysis of, but I know people will ask about, is what's happened since COVID. So our main data is really only going up to pre-March to 2020, but we've got a few weeks of data on Parkrun time since it resumed in July, and so the preliminary, very preliminary analysis suggests that the COVID-19 recession has been quite different to the previous business cycle that we analysed in the paper, and specifically we find that people in pretty much all age categories have got slower since they've come back after the pandemic, and the largest relative drop-off in time has been among oldest runners. So the oldest runners in the data set seem to have done seem to have fared the worst during COVID, whereas in previous recessions they seem to actually do better in terms of their times. As I mentioned in the introduction, there were sort of sequence of papers that looked at mortality rates using pretty much aggregate US state level data, and found evidence that they were strongly pro-cyclical, that mortality rates went up during recoveries and fell during recessions, but there's no real explanation. My reading of the literature is that there's no real explanation for why exactly that is. There's been a sequence of papers since that initial paper by Christopher Room and the QJE that have sort of tried to nail that down and narrow down exactly what's going on. And it's suggestive that what's going on is not actually driven by changes in individuals' own labour force status. So the argument there, I think, is twofold. One, if you look among just working age people, most of the cyclicality and mortality rates is due to motor vehicle accidents. And in fact, motor vehicle deaths in the US are pretty much, I think, that the cyclicality is similar across all age categories. So it's not that more people are driving to work and having accidents. It seems more like people are being hit by more traffic during good times when there's more traffic on the road. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence that people are sort of dying at lower rates during recessions because they've lost their jobs. And secondly, if you look at most of the cyclicality is actually driven by people that are over 65 who are probably not in the labour market. So there's sort of a lot of cyclicality and deaths by sort of various categories for older people in the US, even though you wouldn't expect people in this age range to have experienced job loss. And in fact, the cyclicality gets stronger and stronger as you go up the age distribution. So there's very strong cyclicality among over 80s, even though they're almost certainly not working. And there's a paper by Stevens et al. That claimed that noted that this sort of cyclicality and mortality rates among older people was particularly strong among those living in nursing homes. And they found evidence that was suggestive that what might be going on is that there's cyclical fluctuations in the quality of healthcare. So their argument is that the cyclicality in the business cycle affects the quality of the workers that care homes can hire, and that may feed on to the quality of care that's provided and therefore on to mortality rates. So they provided one potential mechanism by which this cyclicality and mortality rates might show up among older workers or older people. And then, as I also mentioned in the introduction, there's sort of this series of longitudinal studies using event study analysis and other techniques that shows that job loss leads to worse physical health outcomes later on. And obviously, the implication there is that if during recessions, when more people are losing their jobs, health levels should go down, at least among those people who are directly affected by job loss. So this would seem to be at odds with the studies using aggregate data, there's certainly my reading of the literature is that it's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of heterogeneity potentially across age groups, and indeed in a review paper looking at those aggregate data studies by Dridakis, the conclusion was that more work is needed on this issue. In particular, many studies failed to control for age cohorts. and the fact that the impact of recessions could well differ between subgroups within a country. So at least in those 2 counts, we hopefully do a little bit better than some of the previous studies. So we're going to look at the effects of not mortality. We're going to look at the effects of the business cycle on fitness levels, which we don't think has been analysed before. One of the studies looking at mortality found that in the US, the largest contributor to the cyclical pattern of mortality among those over 65 was deaths due to cardiovascular problems. And I think I already mentioned that in the UK, about 25% of deaths are caused by heart or circulatory diseases. The British Health Foundation, this is a slightly dubious statistic, but the British Health Foundation claims that being more physically active can reduce the risk of developing heart and circulatory diseases by as much as 35%. So not quite sure. They didn't provide any evidence for where that number comes from, but I think the point is well taken that being physically active can improve health outcomes and reduce the risk of mortality due to various heart or circulatory diseases. And we would expect fitness to respond more quickly. If mortality is being driven by economic conditions, then we would expect fitness we would expect an effect of economic conditions on fitness to show up much more quickly. We're hoping to find a stronger pattern in the data if there really is some true effect of the business cycle on people's health levels. And that's where Parkrun comes in. So Parkrun is a series of free timed 5K running events. So they stress that they're not races because they want to encourage the sort of community the sport side of things more than the sort of competitive side. But the key thing is it's free, which leads to very high participation rates. 5K, which is reasonable distance for most people. Some people walk it, so a lot of older people participate and just walk. And their times are recorded. All they need to do is just register once and then print out a barcode that you take along and get scanned at the end and connected to it to your time. So it's very easy to attend. There's no rigmarole. There's no race numbers or anything like in a marathon or any other paid for event. And there's almost 700 locations in the UK, so it's very accessible to people. I've got the map. There's the map there with the UK Parkrun locations on it. So not that you can really see where they are because there's so many of them now. The first event started in London in Bushy Park in October of 2004, and it's grown up since then. So the data set we're collecting all the data going right back to October 2004, but obviously the number of people participating has gone up massively over the 17 years. And as you can also see on the map there, there's obviously parkruns in various other countries, which we're not analysing here just to focus on what's going on in the UK, but there's hundreds more events around the UK. And Parkrun takes place every Saturday, COVID notwithstanding. So every Saturday, and then they have sort of special events on Christmas and New Year's Day. So we've got potentially a huge amount of data. Well, not potentially, we have got a huge amount of data in there, and potentially people can record a lot of times over the course of a year or over their lifetime. And James has very diligently scraped using web scraping techniques all the data on individual times from the Parkrun's website, from the first event in October 2004 up to when it was suspended in 2020, and also 4 weeks after. And then he's also collected 4 weeks of data since events resumed in July. So we can mostly I won't be using those 4 weeks for most of the analysis, but I'll come back to it at the end and just to comment on what the initial evidence suggests about COVID. So we have about 11.3 million observations for men and 8.5 million observations for women over that time period. There's a lot of repeat runners in the data set, so that works out to about 600,000 odd men and women in there. 600,000 odd unique men and women in the data set. We've got each person's full history of times, parkrun times, measured in seconds. The locations where they ran. So a lot of people run their local parkrun, but then they might travel around the country to other venues. So we know the location of where they ran each week, the date of their runs, and also their most recent gender and age category. So the age categories are basically in 5-year 5-year intervals, as I've listed there. Then the economic condition data is from the annual population survey, which we've merged in. We've collected both the employment rate, so employment as a fraction of the working age population, and activity rates, that's the sum of employment and unemployment as a fraction of the working age population. And we've merged those in both at the NUTS1 region and quarter level. So that's sort of just called the regional employment or regional activity rate. But then we've also dug down and worked out the employment and activity rates for each combination of region, age category, and gender and quarter. So we've actually also got these group, what I'll call group employment or group activity rates, which pertain to a person-specific, location, gender, and age category. And we'll use both of those in turn in the data. So the aggregate, the regional employment rates, sort of analogous to what a lot of the sort of aggregate studies have done, looking at mortality in the US. But we think we can get a bit further by using these specific, these demographic cell-specific employment rates. So there's some descriptive stats for you across just the full data set. So time in seconds probably not super helpful. I'll show you the distribution of times in a minute. But what I wanted to stress here was that there are people. It's quite a lot of people participating across the age distribution here. So though those participation or the fraction of participants in the older categories are obviously much smaller. They still, given the large size of the data set, they still account for a lot of people. I think it works out about 600. We've got about 600,000 observations on people age 65 and over. Sorry, men, just for men, about 600,000 observations for men age 65 and over in the data set. So we've got plenty of older people in there, even though obviously they account for a smaller fraction of parkrun runners. And there's the distribution of times by gender, just across the full data set. So I defy you to find a more normally closer to normally distributed. Well, maybe you can, but it's by my standards, that's a pretty good bell-shaped distribution there. So obviously there are more men in the data set than women. Men are also faster than women. There's some interesting sort of kinks in the data set there, which we think are due to people trying to get below certain times, just below 30 minutes or just below 25 minutes and that sort of thing, which we don't think, we don't think affects the results too much. But there's some interesting sort of slight non-smooth bits in the distribution there. And there's the employment rate over the period, the unemployment rate actually. We're going to be using the employment rate in the data set, but here I've just plotted the unemployment rate for reasons I can't remember, over the sample period here. So it basically, the period we're looking at encompasses one whole business cycle, starting off at fairly low unemployment in 2004, then through the recession after 2008, there was sort of rapid increase in unemployment, and then it's fallen off. Well, it fell off again and fell fairly steadily up until when Parkrun abruptly closed down operations in March of last year. So we're going to be sort of exploiting the sort of increase and then decrease in unemployment over this period. So to begin with, just to really sort of do an analysis that sort of is consistent as possible with what the US studies did, we've used the regional employment rate as our measure of business cycle. So what we do here is regress a person's parkrun time in seconds on their regional employment rate. So that's the employment rate for the NUTS1 region in that quarter, plus dummy fixed effects for age category, person, location, and date fixed effects. And we do everything separately by gender. So let's just have a look at the results. So this is just basically just an attempt to just see what's the overall effect of measures of the business cycle on times. So in the first column, that's men, and we're using the regional employment rate as the measure of business cycle there. So I haven't put that on this. I haven't put the details here, but as I said, we're controlling for person effects. The previous slide, we got person effects, age effects, location effects, and date fixed effects in there. So the date fixed effects are capturing the sort of any aggregate change in the business cycle over that period. And then obviously what we're estimating here is the effects of differences in employment rates across different regions at any point in time. And then you see in the first column that is a strong positive effect of the employment rate on a person's time. So person's times are getting worse. Men's times are getting worse during recovery, and then getting better during recession. Also, just as a side note, the age profile here suggests that the omitted category in ages here is 16 to 19. So you see that people's times actually tend to increase. Tend to improve, or their times decrease, so they get better, get faster up until early 50s, interestingly, and then tend to sort of stabilize and then fall off the cliff a little bit as they get older. So that coefficient in the first column on regional employment rate works out. If you convert that to an elasticity, it works out to about 0.13. So it's quite a strong positive effect, a positive relationship between employment rate and 5K running times. Get a similar positive effect if you use the activity rate rather than the employment rate. The elasticity there is a little lower, 0.07 for men, and then similarly for women, positive and significant effects on running times, regardless of whether we use the employment rate or the activity rate. And the coefficients are a little lower than for men, particularly if we use the employment rate. So it's about half. The elasticity is only about 0.06 for women compared to 0.13 for men. So overall, there's evidence that that's consistent with these sort of aggregate studies in the US looking at mortality rates. The fitness deteriorates during good times and improves during recessions. But what we do next is to break that relationship up, basically interact the employment rate and the activity rate by age category, and just see how does that relationship vary across the age distribution. And you see that there's quite a lot of variation there, both for men and women. This is where we use the employment rate as the measure of economic conditions. Young people aren't very strongly affected by the employment rate here, but older people are much more strongly affected by the employment rate. So consistent with these studies looking at the mortality rate, older people have much more cyclicality in their times over the business cycle. And similar, well, sort of similar pattern for activity rate, except that there's this sort of dropping off the cliff at the oldest age category there. But in general, there's sort of this upward sloping relationship that older people are more sensitive to the business cycle in terms of their running times. So that's using just the regional employment rate, which is, I think, more or less what most of the studies have done, looking at mortality rates. But we can go a little bit better because we've also got the employment and activity rates within narrow cells. So we've got the employment rate within combination of region, gender, and age category, corresponding to the Parkrun age categories. And obviously that will provide a better measure of the exact economic conditions facing a particular person. And then, of course, the other benefit is that we can control for more things. So if we've got variation across demographic groups, we can control not just for the sort of age, person, location effects, but we can also allow for a location times date fixed effect. So essentially, we're allowing for each location to have its own business cycle, its own pattern over time, and we're exploiting the fact that we've got differential trends in business conditions across age and gender groups. So what we're sort of partialing out here is the sort of the overall change in business conditions in any location, and then identifying the coefficient here from the fact that for example, men aged 30 to 39 had an employment rate that went up faster than the overall employment rate did. So we're going to regress the Parkrun time on the group employment rate, the sort of demographic group specific employment rate, interacted by age group to allow heterogeneity across the age profile. And then we're also controlling for age category and person fixed effects plus location times date fixed effects. And you get a completely different pattern here. So if you're, if you look at this relationship between a person's running times and the economic conditions in their own demographic cell, their own demographic group, age and gender group, then you see this no longer the sort of upward sloping relationship. Instead, you see quite strong negative effects for men sort of age 20 to 50 roughly. Then suddenly swings around, it becomes positive at older age groups, and then tapers off a little bit at the upper end there at 80. And women, similar pattern. So women have a similar pattern at older levels, but in those sort of 30 to 50 range, they have much smaller effects than men. It's it's similar to men up to age 30, similar negative effect, and then sort of roughly insignificant, or certainly small in an economic sense, between 30 and 50, and then these positive effects at older age categories. So we think this is stronger. Obviously, we're controlling for much more variation here, and we're more confident of these results. And we think these results are also reflective of any of the specific economic factors that are acting on any person. And this sort of negative effect for men at younger. So just to reiterate what what the signs mean here. So the men and women over 50 have the positive sign here means that during recessions, they're actually getting faster. For men under 50, that those negative elasticities mean that men are actually getting slower during recessions. So there's sort of this split. Older people are doing better during recessions; they're getting faster. Younger people are, particularly for men, or younger and middle-aged men and younger women, are getting slower during recessions. So it's quite a stark division in that split in the age distribution there. If we use the activity rates, not quite as straightforward. Again, there's evidence though that older people are doing better during recessions, but then for men, there's a sort of that positive effect also at the younger stage categories there, which would suggest that for those sort of men aged sort of 16 to 25, they're also doing better during recessions. So they're the sort of the key results that we have. on times. So we would like to dig obviously more into this. We don't unfortunately have any measures of people's actual labour market variables. We don't know whether they were working or not, obviously, so we can only speculate on what's driving the sort of different results across the age profile. What we can do, though, is also look at what's going on at the extensive margin. So obviously all the results so far rely on runners, sort of continuing to, being driven by runners who continue to participate in Parkrun throughout, the business cycle, changes in the business cycle. But obviously some people can drop out at certain points as economic conditions improve or worsen. So to look at that, where we've tried sort of aggregating the data by region and calculating participation rates. So the number of park runners per capita, number of park runners per population in each region. Or actually, sorry, within each region, gender, age category cells. So we've sort of aggregated the data up to region, gender, age category cells, and then divided by the population estimate for that cell for 2012, which is the midpoint in the sample. So we've got an estimate of the number of runners each week per population in each of those sort of gender, age, region cells. And then we've tried regressing that on the employment or activity rates for that particular cell, interacted by age group again, and then also controlling for age category times date and region times date fixed effects to control for differences in the business cycle that may differ across regions or age categories. Yeah, so I'm nervous about the size of the effects here. So this definitely needs more work, but just to confirm this. But what the sort of initial analysis seems to just suggest is that there's very strong, much stronger effects of business conditions on participation. So the elasticities here are quite very large. What we see particularly in that sort of middle, that sort of 30 to 39 period, the sort of difference between men and women. So the negative elasticity for men between 30 and 39 says that as the employment rate improves, these men are pulling out of Parkrun, or they're less likely to participate in Parkrun, whereas women are more likely to participate. So sort of different, interesting sort of difference in the direction of the effects of the business cycle on the two genders in that age category, and then smaller effects for most other age categories, except they're still quite large in sort of an absolute sense. And then a similar pattern for participation rates. Again, similar pattern when we use activity rates. So participation drops for men as the activity rate goes up in that sort of 30 to 39 age range, and participation among women in that age range goes up at that time. So they're the main results that we have so far, looking at sort of changes at the intensive and the extensive margin as the business cycle changes, using that data from 2004 to 2020 up to when the wheels fell off everything in March of last year. And then at that point there was Parkrun closed down. I think the last Parkrun was on March the 14th last year. And then it shut down completely in the UK until July of this year. There was various attempts to restart it, and I think many people would question why it stopped at all as an outdoor event that was fairly well socially distanced, but it did stop completely for about 16 months, and then restarted in July of this year. And obviously, there's a big question about what has COVID done to people's fitness levels, that we can address that. Obviously, it's a bit difficult to do within the context of the analysis I've already shown you for at least three reasons. One, The interpretation of employment and activity rates has changed due to the furlough scheme, so it's not completely clear what we're measuring when we look at employment and activity rates from the annual population survey, and how consistent they will be with previous years as a measure of the state of the business cycle. Secondly, obviously we didn't have any observations for that 16-month period, so we can't see how people's times were gradually changing between March and July, March of last year and July of this year. And then obviously, you might think that COVID was just the last 18 months have been just substantively different to previous recessions, in the sense that there's been limitations on what we can do outside and where we can go. And obviously many people, particularly older people, might be scared to go outside or to sort of engage in certain activities like running. People may have actually behaved in a different way over the last 18 months to the way they would have behaved in during previous recessions. But with all those excuses aside, we've tried to have a sort of preliminary look at what's happened to times since people returned to Parkrun. So the idea here was to regress a person's time on person effects, and then age category times date dummies, using data from a couple of years before the lockdown and the few weeks we have after the lockdown. So we're looking at the same people before the Parkrun, before the lockdown, and seeing how they were doing, taking out their sort of average time and controlling for their age, and then looking at how their times have changed after the lockdown. And then we just basically calculate the sort of average coefficients on the sort of dates for the four first Parkruns back after Parkrun resumed, and then comparing those coefficients on the dates, those date coefficients for the equivalent. Sorry, that should be 4 Saturdays 2 years earlier. So obviously the trick at the moment is that we had relatively few observations, so it could be weather effects that have slowed everyone down. So the best at the moment we can do is to just compare the 4 Parkruns that we had after Parkrun resumed with the equivalent weeks of the year from two summers earlier. So hopefully, the ground conditions and weather was roughly similar. And what we found is that both men and women were very almost identical in that they were overall, men and women were both about 1.5% slower after they came back after the pandemic. So that works out to about 30 seconds. But there's also big differences again across the age profile. So the very youngest, not the very youngest, but the 21 to 24-year-olds were slightly faster when they came back. But for all other older age categories, people were slower when they came back. So what I'm showing here is the percent increase in a person's time since the sort of equivalent weeks in 2019. So you can see that it's the oldest runners here who have fared the worst. So the 70 to 74-year-olds are almost 6% slower since they came back, and sort of this roughly monotonic effect of age on running times suggests that older runners have done particularly worse. So this is in contrast to the evidence I showed earlier that suggests that older people actually have in general done quite well during previous recessions. They've improved their running times, and younger people have dropped off. This suggests that everyone's dropped off, but older runners have done the worst. So that's all I have for you for now. We're still working on this, as I said. So just to summarize, the data for using these millions of observations that we have from Parkrun give us a way to estimate the relationship between economic conditions and fitness levels if we take people's running times as a measure of their fitness. We find that recessions improve running times for older men and women, but they worsen times for young and middle-aged men and for younger women. We also find that participation rates are very sensitive to economic conditions, and that men in their 30s increase participation when conditions improve, economic conditions improve, but women in their 30s reduce participation when the economy recovers. And then a very initial glance at the data suggests that the COVID-19 recession has been different, and that older runners have done particularly bad, have fared particularly badly. Their times have got particularly slower compared to younger runners. So what we're hoping to do in the future is to sort of dig down on the sort of post-COVID data. We've so far just scraped the first 4 weeks since people returned, but obviously it's been a few more weeks now, and as we add more weeks, we can get obviously a more accurate idea of what's happened post COVID. And we'd like to relate that, even though we don't think that employment rates and activity rates are a good measure of what's happened to the economy over the last 18 months, we think that it would be useful to try and relate the change in people's times and whether they participate at all to local COVID-19 cases or vaccination rates. So is there any evidence that people are not coming back to Parkrun, or if they've come back, that their times have really dropped off a lot if they live in places that have had a lot of COVID-19 cases or low vaccination rates? So that's something that we'd like to do and try and give a little more sort of quantitative evidence on what's happened to fitness levels since COVID-19 hit us. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kerry. There's been, Carl has been in the comments with some concerns about the labour force survey data. Basically, I guess I can either paraphrase him, and if I get him wrong, then he can chip in. But concerned particularly about the older age brackets, how precisely measured would the 80+ employment rate be for women, for example, because there's only 60,000 people in the labour force survey. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Kerry.
Yeah, I mean, that's so. Yeah, that's why we started with the. I mean, it's a tough one. I think one of the mortality rate papers also tries to sort of put in group employment rate or group unemployment rates and sort of aggregate employment rates, and that's why we tried it both ways. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing really is that if you look at the sort of cell, the effects of a person's own employment, the employment rate in a person's specific cell, there is, practically no effect on people 80+. So, that's sort of consistent with the idea that these people aren't really being driven by and their fitness isn't really driven by the few people that are in the labour market in that age range. But yeah, it's a tricky thing. I've thought about can we put in both sort of the aggregate employment rate and the employment rate for the cell, and as a way of sort of measuring what's if you're old, what's your children, what employment rate is affecting your children. I haven't quite worked out the best way to do that, or whether that's a sensible thing to do, putting in both the sort of aggregate employment rate and the cell specific employment rate.
Carl's got his hand up, so Carl, do you want to follow up?
Thanks, Kerry. So I was concerned because I thought these were at region level as well. I was thinking this is going to get to 1 or 2 people.
Oh yeah.
And I think you get 0 because that's just measurement error. And you could check by just making those cell sizes bigger and seeing how it varies.
Making them bigger just by grouping the
bigger age groups. Yeah. I have no idea. At the region level, I can't imagine there's that many 80+ women in Sunderland in employment, or even in the household survey. That's my concern. But even across the board, I'd just be worried about attenuation really working against you across all of those results. And that might vary across women and men as well, of course, in the labour force. So I don't know, at different age groups.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, I guess I was heartened by the fact that the coefficient's quite small in that group, that age range. So it's sort of, yeah, but yeah, like you said, the what's going on the right hand side is pretty noisy for those people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the right hand side. It's the right hand side that's the worry, not the left hand side for once.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. We need to.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to think about that. Yeah, I mean the US studies obviously are suggesting that it's not being driven by a person's own experience of the sort of mortality cyclicality is not driven by a person's own experience of the labour market. So yeah, they're saying that these older people are affected by what's going on in the labour market for younger people. So but how we sort of bring that into the model is not clear to me yet. So, yeah, thanks for that's a good reminder of data problems.
Thanks, Carl. And Wayne's got his hand up.
Hi, Kerry.
Hi, Wayne.
How are you?
I'm good.
So I got a question about the data. I came in slightly late, so I may have missed something at the beginning, but I'm wondering in general about the data, what the entry and exit of people is, in the data set of runners. And then it seemed like it'd be nice to know from the very beginning, the first year, kind of throughout, what's the seasonal participation of your typical runners and runners. So to what extent are you getting people who participate basically weekly or, I don't know, twice a month, and then you get to follow them for a long period of time, dedicated, regular, ritualistic runners, as opposed to other people who are doing a variety of kinds of exercise and things. So I don't know quite, how this would be insightful, but it just seems like from the reader's point of view, it'd just be nice to know how many people are entering and exiting the data that you have over this period of time, how many people kind of are spanning the business cycle, and were there for several years before and several years after. What were their basic patterns of participation? And then for people who are like dedicated participants, as opposed to people who are kind of entering and exiting this stuff for whatever reason, that they've become enthusiastic or lost enthusiasm or bought a Peloton or whatever it was.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we should show some more descriptive sets. I realize they don't actually, I don't think I've actually looked at the distribution of number of events by number of events per person. So that's obviously something we should look at. Yeah, I'm not sure. I suspect there's a lot of people that only come and run 1 or 2 times and then drop out. And then obviously, the other extreme, there's people that are there for years or decades, racking up hundreds of runs.
It seems like those regular participants would be particularly interesting. Of the people who the years before and the years after, and then whatever, how are those people changing their behavior? So people who are like dedicated runners, but yeah. I mean, but I guess we get back into the you might have missed this at the start. The usual criticism of sports papers that these are not representative of the average person, the runners that are there for years. If they're that committed to their fitness. So yeah, I mean that's also why we think we thought we should look at the participation rates. How many people are actually showing up at different points during the business cycle. I think this data is quite terrific, and it's quite appropriate to think of this as a regular kind of economic data of moviegoers and streamers of stuff and social media participants. I mean, I think the data is great. And like so many things, people dip in and out of participating in different markets. So, but I think thinking seriously about who's a participant and what kind of participant, and then what information it gives about changing behavior. I mean, who do you really want to be focused on as folks who are changing their behavior and so responding to economic conditions? but the setup you have is great.
I guess the other thing we have with the long, although I don't know how we pin this back to the business cycle, is that we do see people over a longer time. So you know, their health issues could be the result of years of neglect of their fitness. So yeah, I'm not sure how we get at that, but yeah, we are potentially seeing people sort of participate, you know, their activity rates over a longer period, and whether that matters is something that yeah, could be something we should think more about. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
And Kerry, are you in this data set?
Yeah, I think I'm in there a few times. I count for a few of those. I think James does.
Okay, good.
Alex, but yeah, that's the first paper I've done where I'm actually in the data set, I think. So.
Got it. All right, good. Thanks.
Thanks, Wayne. Alex.
Yeah, so following up on what Wayne has said, in any panel analysis, you want to know how your results differ with the balancedness of the panel. And in this case, I think Wayne's right that you probably, if people keep turning up, then there might be a different type of committed runner. So you might get heterogeneous effects based upon how balanced we make the analysis as we go. And I think we should do that. Of course, you got also, in this case, you've got latecomers and early comers, as you say, Kerry. The people who started off in 04 are probably the real nutters. That was probably you, I expect. And then people joined the party later. But you can develop this further. Let's take, for example, your stuff at the end on COVID versus the non-COVID results. And you say, oh, look, they're different. But of course, in the COVID stuff, what you got is a totally balanced panel, because you've only got people who you saw pre and post. So my suggestion would be we take a couple of periods before COVID and do exactly the same thing. We take the same gaps, but didn't have COVID in between. We have a fully balanced analysis. Yeah, so we have people who are in the pre and the post period with the pretend placebo COVID in the middle, i.e. a period where we don't observe anything. We can even take periods that are quasi-recessionary, Great Recession, for example, and compare them using these data and compare the Great Recession with the COVID stuff for a balanced panel to make it fair. So that we're then comparing a like analysis with another like analysis. I think that's a way to go. And the other thing, of course, is we could think about the impact of the business cycle on exit and entry. So you've done something on that, but I think that's, I mean, I'm not quite sure why people would actually genuinely cut out for business cycle reasons, unless they are time constrained. You know, suddenly everybody's got a job or is working longer hours, and that squeezes stuff out. Obviously, we know in the COVID period, it might be because they sort of died or became seriously ill or something, or got much more desperate to start running because they felt they were getting fat. So all those sorts of things are going on. The only other thing I wondered about when you were talking about this is Saturdays. All the data are Saturdays, aren't they? Is that right?
Almost all of it, except for they do special runs on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. So they're obviously different days of the week.
So the time constraint issue around, oh, I'm working, does vary, doesn't it, occupationally? And I don't know whether I keep being struck by the men and the women and the different ages, and then thinking, how do we pull it back to the mechanisms that you invoked in the literature earlier? I'm sure we'll get there one way or another in a cunning fashion, but at the moment some of it's a bit tough, because you've talked about people being hit by cars, we talk about health effects, we talk about income constraints. Of course, unless people have to commute to these things, they're not income constrained in this regard because it's free, which is a great thing, which is why it's not really like a market, Wayne, not really. It's something else. It's a non-market activity, this. Although, of course, it might substitute for market activity like going to a paid gym, which is an issue. But I guess one of our big challenges is relating it back to that literature that you invoked in the first place, and we're going to have to be cunning to be able to do some of that, aren't we?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the issues at the moment with the few observations post-COVID is just whether there's weather effects that obviously that, over a normal year, those effects, you can sort of even them out. But so far, there's relatively few observations since people came back. So I'm not sure how much, the weather or ground conditions have affected people's time. So that makes it a little harder to, with the main analysis, obviously I can put in date effects, and that can capture, around the country, or even location times date effects, which captures, whether it was a bad week for everyone. And then the identification is coming by the fact we've got different measures of employment rates for different age categories. But the pre-post COVID stuff, at the moment, we don't know whether everyone's slower just because maybe I don't know. I haven't made an analysis of how good the weather's been since July, but whether everyone's slower just because it's been worse than it has been in previous Julys or something.
It was, wasn't it? The weather's been crap since about July. So.
In the UK, the weather always seems crap compared to previous years, regardless of what year you're in. But
we've got Peter with the next question.
Thank you, James. That was great. Thanks, Kerry. That's really interesting. There's a follow-up kind of from what Wayne and Alex were mentioning about. I had a thought about new participants, and obviously whether there's any evidence of new participants coming in the kind of business cycle. But then I had a further thought about further extensions, which doesn't tie in any way whatsoever with the previous literature or your kind of main thrust of the paper. And that was other special events which have happened. So obviously the Olympics in 2012 clearly is the major one in the UK. And what Alex was saying about the before and after effect, I think you could also apply to the Olympics. Obviously there was lots of noises about whether the Olympics inspires people to do more physical activity. You've obviously got data here in terms of times, so you can see whether those who already participate did they get inspired to perform better. Unlikely, but and were more people participating, and was it transitory or a kind of permanent change? So I think there's scopes. You probably already explored these things, but there's definitely scope to do more with the data. Although obviously selling it to an economics paper, to an economics journal, with an Olympics angle, as I know all too well, is probably a bit more of a push than the kind of the business cycle kind of idea.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example of another way we could go. Actually, another idea I've got that is a bit more economicsy, I guess, is that we could look at potentially at the raising of the pension age for women, which I think fits in with our time period. And although we only have age categories in the data I've shown you so far, there is a way that I won't bore you with. There is a way to actually work out a person's exact age. One thing I'd quite like to do is just see, do you see any effects, sort of a triple difference type thing, whether women passing through whatever the new pension age is, change their times or stop participating, or start participating compared to women passing that threshold in earlier years. So there's sort of other angles that we could go in, but this seemed like the easiest one to start off with.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Carl and Wayne have still got their hands up. If you've got any questions you wanted to ask, or were they just up from earlier on?
Mine's up for a reason again.
Go for it, Alex.
I wanted to ask whether given that we have these sports economists amongst us, we had a chat, didn't we, yesterday, as to whether there are any other analyses of sports type data, notwithstanding Kerry's point that, oh dear, they're all superstars, whatever, it doesn't, at one level sort of doesn't matter, because it will give us a lower bound effect of cyclical things, because these people are paid to run around at one level, although clearly some of them don't, but in principle they are. And James told me and Kerry about a little bit of stuff on football that is a bit imprecise because you didn't have the exact distances run, but we were just wondering whether there was any other sports stuff on distances run that was missing from the literature review that could be potentially informative for us.
Kai was on the call. I don't know if he still is co-author from the paper that I mentioned yesterday, Alex. He might have an idea, but he might have gone by now. Carl's got his hand up anyway.
I'm just thinking of sportive rides in Europe, cycling rides. Can you get participation in sportives? These are huge events in mainland Europe. We don't think of them because cycling's not that popular here. But, you know, all that stuff, you know, follow a stage of the Tour de France each year and stuff. Maybe somebody's looked at that. I don't know. But that's all mass participation. And people and guys will be, and you can get it all off Strava, of course, can't you? What they're doing and how they're performing, if they're sharing it.
Yeah, I think the sharing is the issue with Strava, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Peter, did you have your hand up as well?
Yeah, I was going to make the same point that Carl made in terms of you've got Strava, but you've got things like Fitbit and other. I know a few universities are using Moves app, but that's a very recent phenomenon. Obviously, that is a very specific population. There's not a huge amount of variation unless you count older lecturers. It's dominated by young students in there. But that might be another one. There have been some studies which have looked at steps and distances travelled using these. You know, they're just a few. There's loads. Presumably, there's loads of these kind of apps and stuff. But yeah, I guess the problem is getting access to that data, and those companies willing to share it. But there have been a few studies which have done this, particularly in relation to COVID. So I think it's become more popular to kind of look at that in relation to this. But they're fairly limited in terms of sample sizes, and you know, there's not a huge amount. I can kind of send you a few examples of that. Happy to do that.
Should we drop an email to Peloton and ask them if they want to share some data? Like, seriously. We'll help them refine their model, because they must be running out of customers.
Well, there's the other one as well, isn't there? I can't think of the name of it, but my brother-in-law just got the little box he puts on the back of his bike and just sits there with a computer screen in front of him, cycling around the Rocky Mountains and all these kinds of places. Wayne, your hand's still up, is that?
So I'm just wondering what else you could do with the data that would be of interest. So I'm wondering, you know, to the extent that you've got participants that have been with you for, you know, a chunk of the whole time, there must be a fair number of people, I would think, who might run regularly during the summer when, you know, I don't know, school teachers or whatever their occupations are, and then maybe not other times of the year. So, you know, if there are 20% of your sample who are regular summer runners, but sporadic runners other times of the year, is it possible then to take that and then look at how their times change? So if there are people who seasonally have different intensity of exercising, might you be able to then use that data in an interesting way to look at improvement in times, you know, fitness or whatever. Yeah. So and you know, another question I have for you is, with no data on weather, can you use the results to predict what the weather was? So if you look at all the regular runners and you know what their normal times are, and then you see that their times drop by whatever 1%, can you aggregate the data of regular runners who've run whatever the previous, 15 weeks or whatever, and then can you use that to then tell us that there was some change in the weather or some condition that then, influenced outcomes?
Yeah, there's Run Britain, which is, I think, the organisation that the body that sort of organises road running races in the UK, does something like that. They have a handicap that they assign to each person, and that sort of, somehow that's what I guess they're trying to do. They're trying to work out how they're trying to adjust your time for how easy a race was, and they're using the data on in some murky way that they don't make it all clear. They're using the data on people's times in that event relative to what they were predicted to do as a sort of measure of how easy that race was. And I can tell you from my own experience, it's not particularly accurate, but yeah, they're obviously trying to do something like that. I had a student last year who I asked to try and invent a better handicap than the one that Run Britain does, but I'm not sure if he succeeded. But yeah,
well, the typical thing that, I'm a cyclist, but the typical thing that I and others think about is, heat and humidity, and which of them, is more zapping of your energy and diminishes your productivity more. Anyway, so having a long data set like this with some number of people who are like regular, consistent runners, it seems like you get some interesting possibilities of evaluating how productivity varies with these kind of conditions. I mean, there's all this interest in, with climate change, heat and humidity, and how it's affecting worker productivity. And for people who can't, modify the environment and can't cool the environment, how does it affect their ability to produce in a factory or whatever kind of setting? And here you got the possibility, like teasing out some kind of measures of productivity change based upon extreme humidity or heat or whatever it might be. And again, if you got this long balanced data set or periods with balanced data sets where you can get these consistent runner profiles, then you can kind of look at, adjusting for ages and all that kind of stuff as people age and change. But
yeah, there's a lot more.
Yeah,
more we can do. We need some more. Need to think more.
More data collection. Peter.
More data and more brains.
It's just a throwaway remark. Okay, so just take this on so at the start you mentioned about not having elite runners or elite sports people, but there is, I think, because I've looked at Parkrun data before, and you can actually see who the record holders are, can't you, for each event? And I think there is some elite athletes who are kind of masquerading as regular runners on Parkrun just to get the adulation of being on the record holder for that event. I think there was I seem to remember about 2 or 3 years ago, there was an ex-400 or 800 meter runner or some middle distance runner who is the record holder for, I think it's one of the London Parkrun events. So I don't know whether you want to kind of somehow try and tease out the elite athletes from the kind of regular Joes from the data. Can't do that. I know, but maybe if there are obvious people in the sample who are just clearly much quicker than others. Maybe.
Well, that's what's nice about the running data here. The whole spectrum from the elites right down to the slowest 80-year-old.
Or slow 48-year-olds as well.
Even there, and in fact,
let's not be age discriminatory here.
So I've also scraped the Run Britain's website, which has all UK races, and so obviously that's got, you know, more elite runners. I mean, there's plenty of elite runners, yeah, doing parkrun. I think don't think they're hiding. I think they're, you know, they come in to set records, but yeah, with the Run Britain data, you've got, I guess, races with more elite people in there. So there's plenty of options. The problem with those races, the nice thing about parkrun is it's a fixed 5K time. It's sort of this consistency, which is nice about it, that all these other sort of variables are controlled for. Whereas if you take sort of all the races that are run in the UK, there's so many other factors to control for. But yeah, I know. I mean, what I love that, you know, just looking at the distribution of times, you can see just get a really good idea of what the average, well, not necessarily the average person, because there's lots of people that don't participate, but what a much better idea of what people's underlying fitness levels are. And if you just look at, who runs the, you know, in the Olympics.
And I know you've got obviously fixed effects for all the different races, but obviously the kind of terrain and the contours of the route will obviously differ. So obviously where I am in Norfolk, literally they're all flat, but obviously in other parts of the UK, you're going to have, you know, maybe in Bath, for example, there might be one of the park runs where you're kind of running up, well, probably not running up Claverton Hill, for example, but there'll be obviously where you've got kind of more difficult conditions to kind of contend with, regardless of the weather.
Yeah, the one, is not far from the campus here, and it is reasonably hilly, not quite running all the way up the hill, but so I guess, again, the nice thing about the parkrun is that the events don't change, so we can control for, you know, those location effects in a way that obviously, when you've got races that are changing sort of the location or the layout every year, you can't. So yeah, it's sort of nice to have that sort of consistency.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Any more questions and comments?
I'm going to go and do parkrun tomorrow morning. I'm going to get up early, do a 9 AM in Norwich. And I'm new I'll be a new class as a new participant as well. You've inspired me. So, you know,
I'm glad we increased participation by 1. I'm going to do it tomorrow as well, and my times have almost exactly 1 minute slower since since the pandemic than they were before. So that's my personal drop off.
But what it also means, Peter, is I'm scraping the data on Monday for Norwich Parkrun. See how you did.
So I've got to do it now. I can't just say I'm going to do it. I now actually got to go and do it.
Yeah, we need you in the data set.
Yeah, to be honest, that's one of the things you find with self-reported data. When people say that they're motivated or what they claim they have done is obviously different from, you know, what we observe in practice. So I think that's quite important. Yeah. Or I'll get my daughter to do it. She's quicker than me. I'll just get to take my phone.
You have to take him out, James. You don't want to mess up the data set.
Yeah, wrong age category, wrong sex. I mean, it's all wrong, Peter. Anyhow, I guess we'll wrap up there and stop the recording. So thank you, Kerry, very much for a really interesting talk. Thank you, everyone, for contributions. We're going to be back again next week with Arne Feddersen from the Southern Danish University, and his title is To Be Confirmed. So to wait and see what his title is, but we'll be back again next week. So do have a great weekend in the meantime.
Thank you all.